Now, it must be said, many serious conservative scholars and opinion makers remain supportive of President Bush. Not that they are uncritical, but overall they have supported the administration's decisions. You think of Charles Krauthammer and Victor Davis Hanson and Bill Kristol and Max Boot, Fred Barnes. Think here in Washington, AEI, Weekly Standard. In fact, if you take Fred Barnes, an editor of the Weekly Standard, he consistently portrays President Bush in very sympathetic terms. So let's get the balance here. For example, I'm quoting Barnes. Bush is a president who leads. He has the temperament of a self-assured Texas male. He believes the role of a conservative president is to be proactive, bold, energetic, and optimistic. For Bush, clashes with conservatives are inevitable. This is a very telling line here. Clashes with conservatives are inevitable, and given his rebel-in-chief style, President Bush is sometimes willing to take on fights with his conservative base, despite being a true but unorthodox conservative himself. Conservatives who continue to support Bush to the end believe that one of the reasons Barack Obama crushed John McCain is that the administration was hurt in part by its own successes. There were no significant terrorist attacks on U.S. soil after 9/11. The surge in Iraq worked. These were the dogs that didn't bark in this election. Accordingly, when the economic crisis overwhelmed national security concerns after September 15th, well, Bush got the blame. It just wasn't the GOP's year. Now, numerous conservative opinion leaders turned on the Bush presidency before the recession, and with a vengeance. They blamed Bush for deconstructing a coalition that was 5 decades in the making. As Casey Pipes pointed out at lunch, President Bush lost his base. To understand better how the divorce between the conservative opinion leaders and the president came about, I surveyed members of a very prominent conservative organization here in the United States called the Philadelphia Society. And I reviewed the books, articles, and op-eds that conservatives have been generating these past years and studied the split. And even when people personally continued to like George W. Bush, but why they felt in principle they had to split from him. Moreover, I was surprised by the number of conservatives who not only spurned Bush's successor in the GOP, John McCain, but the number that went over to vote for Obama in 2008. Now, first there was the courtship. If you go back to 1999, think back. What a turnaround from 8 or 10 years ago that we've experienced. Look at the way conservatives wooed George W. Bush after he won re-election as Texas governor in 1998. If you would have anticipated the ugly divorce to come. His record as governor had been impressive. In his bid for a second term, he gathered broad support from Democrats, including the Democratic lieutenant governor. And on election day, he carried 239 of Texas's 254 counties. He also appealed to Hispanics, winning almost 50% of their vote. Conservatives observed that all of President Clinton's trips to Texas to support his Democratic opponent for governor, every one of them, came to naught. Given Bush's father, his record as governor, and his appeal to conservatives, Bush quickly became a serious contender for the White House. And on a personal note, I can tell you I was working for Governor Engler at that time, and Governor Engler was the head of the RGA, the Republican Governors Association, and Engler was working very hard to marshal all of the Republican governors behind their fellow governor, George W. Bush, in 1999 and early 2000. And then there was the marriage after this courtship. During the campaign, Governor Bush styled himself a compassionate conservative. The marriage between Bush and movement conservatives occurred in August 2000 at the nominating convention in Philadelphia. His acceptance certainly struck Burkean chords, pleasing to conservative ears. The Palace Guard at National Review reported, quote, on the major issues, Bush was impeccably conservative. Although election 2000 was one of the most controversial in U.S. history, Bush received 11 million more votes than Bob Dole had in 1996. There was a genuine appeal to the conservative base of the GOP. His first inaugural address struck numerous conservative themes, and his first weeks in office were full of symbolic and substantive acts that appealed to conservatives. For instance, on his first day in office, he restored the controversial Mexico City policy that outlaws using U.S. taxpayer funds to pay for abortions overseas. Soon after that, he established the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. Bush would go on to experience 2 honeymoons in 2001. The first was rather modest, as Bush enjoyed approval ratings in the mid-50s. But then, just as his numbers were starting to sag a bit, 9/11 happened. And this tragedy led to Bush's second honeymoon, when his job approval ratings, as you know, soared to 80 and 90%. Virtually all conservatives were backing him at that point. And with the prodding of Karl Rove, the president threw red meat at his base, his conservative base, cutting taxes, invading Iraq, intervening in the Terry Schiavo case. As the first president of the 21st century, Bush looked, acted, and talked like a philosophical conservative for the durable Republican majority to come. How quaint and old those words now sound. Then the end of the honeymoon. Because between the 2 honeymoons were already grumblings of discontent among conservatives. Just 6 months into the administration, go back to June 2001, before 9/11, libertarians were criticizing Bush's protectionist policies towards steel. Small government conservatives were criticizing ongoing agricultural subsidies. Cultural conservatives and national security types were criticizing immigration policy toward Latinos. As events unfolded, the cacophony of voices critical of Bush rose to ever higher decibels. You're well familiar with the litany. Protests against the further federalization of education and No Child Left Behind, against the huge expansion of Medicare, against the misuse of intelligence in an errand for WMD, against the prosecution of the war in Iraq, against parts of the Patriot Act, against the bungled response to Hurricane Katrina, against the attempts to nominate Harriet Miers, as Tom just pointed out, to the U.S. Supreme Court, against a vice president whose chief of staff seemed to act above the law. The list goes on and on. As events unfolded, several major conservative responses took shape against the president these folks had once supported. Let's look at just 3 of them. Let's look first at the economic conservatives, the divorce by the fiscal conservatives that took place. One of the earliest, most vociferous criticisms leveled against Bush came from the fiscal conservatives. Among their number are George Will, Dick Armey, Grover Norquist, Stephen Moore. Their standard bearer could be Bruce Bartlett. Bartlett is an economist with impeccable conservative credentials. As an early supply-sider, he worked for Ron Paul, Texas Congressman Ron Paul, who just was running for president. In 1981, he joined the Reagan administration and helped craft that year's famous tax cuts. Also, during the first year of Reagan's presidency, he wrote a book, Reaganomics, one of the Wall Street Journal's best business books of the year. Now, fast forward 2 decades. Although he denies it now, Bartlett had high hopes for George W. Bush back in 2001, and in fact, he helped craft Bush's early tax cuts. But when the 43rd president tried to woo moderates by adopting parts of the liberal agenda, Bartlett quit the White House. Moreover, in 2005, he lost his job at a free market think tank for openly criticizing Bush. With some spare time on his hands, since he lost that job, he wrote a book, penned a polemic published by Doubleday called Imposter: How George W. Bush Bankrupted America and Betrayed the Reagan Legacy. Chapter 1 starts, I know conservatives, and George W. Bush is no conservative.